February 20, 1974. Lubang Island, Philippines. Local farmer Norio Suzuki was trekking through dense jungle, searching for something most people would consider impossible. He was looking for Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese soldier who supposedly had been hiding in these mountains for nearly 30 years, refusing to believe that World War II had ended. Most people thought Onoda was dead, or a myth. A legend told by locals to explain mysterious incidents in the jungle, burned crops with no obvious arsonist, missing livestock with no trace, strange footprints that disappeared into the undergrowth. But Suzuki believed. He had traveled from Japan specifically to find this phantom soldier. He had spent weeks camping in the jungle, leaving signs, hoping to make contact. And on this February morning, his persistence paid off. Suzuki spotted movement in the trees. Not an animal, too deliberate, too careful. Someone was watching him. He turned slowly and saw a figure standing 30 meters away. A man in tattered military uniform, face weathered by decades of sun and rain, holding a rifle with practiced ease. The man was thin, almost skeletal, but his posture was ramrod straight. Military bearing unmistakable even after 3 decades. This was Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, 52 years old. The last Japanese soldier still fighting World War II, 29 years after Japan's surrender. What happened next would shock Japan and the world, because Onoda's story wasn't just about survival, it was about loyalty taken to its absolute extreme. About a man so committed to his orders that he waged a one-man war for 3 decades against an enemy that had stopped fighting in 1945. This is the story of how a soldier's duty became delusion, how honor became obsession, how a man could live in the jungle for 29 years, killing civilians, destroying property, refusing to accept reality, and how eventually one person managed to do what entire search parties, government officials, and even Onoda's own family couldn't accomplish. Bring him home. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in Kamakawa, a small village in Wakayama Prefecture on Japan's main island of Honshu. He entered the world during a period of intense Japanese nationalism and militarism, when the empire was expanding aggressively across Asia and the Pacific. His family was traditional, middle-class, deeply invested in Japanese cultural values. His father managed a small school. His mother maintained their home according to strict traditional principles. Onoda grew up learning the importance of duty, honor, loyalty to emperor and nation above all personal considerations. The Japan of Onoda's childhood was transforming. The nation was industrializing rapidly, building a modern military, asserting itself as a major power. Japanese education emphasized emperor worship, martial values, sacrifice for the greater good. Children learned that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. That surrender was the deepest shame imaginable. Young Onoda absorbed these lessons completely. He was a serious child, studious, disciplined. He excelled in school not through brilliance, but through relentless effort. He memorized what needed memorizing, practiced what needed practice, never complained, never quit. At age 17, Onoda left school to work for a trading company in Wuhan, China. Japan had invaded China in 1937, and Japanese businesses were exploiting newly conquered territories. Onoda worked as a clerk, learning Chinese, experiencing occupied China firsthand. He saw Japanese military power, saw Chinese resistance, began to understand that war was not the glorious adventure portrayed in propaganda. But understanding war's reality didn't diminish his loyalty. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. Japan was his nation. The emperor was his divine leader. Whatever Japan did was right by definition. This was the core belief that would sustain Onoda through 3 decades of jungle isolation. In 1942, at age 20, Onoda received his military draft notice. Japan was now fighting a massive war across the Pacific against the United States, Britain, and their allies. The initial Japanese victories of 1941 and 1942 were giving way to American counterattacks. Japan needed every able-bodied man. Onoda reported for basic training at an infantry base. He learned to shoot, march, follow orders without question. The training was brutal by design. Drill instructors beat recruits for minor infractions. sleep deprivation, starvation rations, endless physical punishment. The goal was to break individual will, replace it with absolute obedience to superiors. Onoda endured. He was not the strongest recruit, not the fastest, not the most naturally talented, but he was among the most determined. He never quit, never showed weakness, never complained. These qualities caught the attention of his superiors. In late 1944, Onoda received surprising orders. He was being transferred to Nakano School, the Imperial Japanese Army's intelligence and guerrilla warfare training center. This was an enormous honor. Nakano School accepted only the most elite candidates, training them in espionage, sabotage, guerrilla tactics, survival skills. The school was established to create special operations soldiers who could operate independently behind enemy lines. Students learned unconventional warfare, how to survive with minimal supplies, how to gather intelligence, how to conduct sabotage operations, how to never surrender, continuing to fight even when cut off from command. Onoda's training lasted several months. He learned jungle survival, how to identify edible plants, how to hunt and trap animals, how to create shelter from natural materials. He studied map reading, compass navigation, moving silently through dense vegetation. He practiced guerrilla tactics, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, how to maximize damage while minimizing risk. But the most important lesson was psychological. Nakano School instructors drilled into students that surrender was absolutely forbidden under any circumstances, that they should continue fighting even when isolated, even when the situation seemed hopeless, that their duty transcended personal survival. The instructors told them that the enemy would use psychological warfare, would claim Japan had surrendered, would show fake newspapers, forged documents. Actors pretending to be Japanese officials ordering surrender. Everything was a trick to capture valuable intelligence officers. The students must never believe these deceptions. This training would prove crucial, because the mindset Onoda developed at Nakano School would sustain him for 29 years in the Philippine jungle, would prevent him from accepting reality even when confronted with overwhelming evidence that the war had ended. December 1944, Onoda received his operational assignment. He would be sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines as part of a small intelligence unit. Their mission: conduct guerrilla warfare against American forces, gather intelligence, destroy supplies and infrastructure, make the island as costly as possible for the enemy to occupy. Lubang Island was small, approximately 125 square miles, located about 90 miles southwest of Manila in the Philippine Sea. The island had about 8,000 civilian residents, mostly farmers and fishermen. It was strategically positioned near major shipping lanes, making it valuable real estate in the Pacific War. Onoda's commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him specific orders that would define the next 3 decades of his life. Taniguchi told Onoda to fight a guerrilla campaign on Lubang Island, to avoid direct confrontation with American forces, to survive, gather intelligence, conduct sabotage operations. Most importantly, never surrender under any circumstances. Continue fighting until relieved or until receiving direct orders from a superior officer to cease operations. Taniguchi emphasized that the Americans would try psychological warfare, would claim Japan had surrendered, would show fake documents. Onoda must not be deceived. He must continue his mission regardless of what he saw or heard. Onoda understood. He saluted. He would obey. He arrived on Lubang Island in late December 1944 with 3 other soldiers: Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shuichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. These 4 men would form a guerrilla cell operating independently, causing maximum disruption to American occupation forces. The mission seemed straightforward: fight, survive, never surrender, wait for relief. Relief never came. August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender via radio broadcast. World War II was over. Japan had lost. The Emperor himself ordered all Japanese military forces to lay down their arms and cease fighting immediately. Across the Pacific, on dozens of islands and remote outposts, Japanese soldiers heard the news. Most surrendered within days or weeks. Some took longer, needing time to verify the incredible claim that Japan had actually surrendered. A few held out for months, isolated in jungles or caves, gradually accepting reality when rescue parties showed them evidence. But Onoda and his small group on Lubang Island did not surrender. They heard rumors of Japan's surrender from Filipino civilians, saw leaflets dropped by American planes announcing the war's end, calling for Japanese soldiers to surrender peacefully. The leaflets included the Emperor's surrender message, photographs of Japanese officials signing surrender documents, offers of safe passage home. Onoda examined the leaflets carefully. His Nakano school training immediately triggered. This was exactly the psychological warfare his instructors had warned about. The enemy was trying to trick him into surrendering by showing fake documents, forged photographs, manufactured propaganda. The leaflets were too convenient, too perfectly designed to undermine morale. Real surrender orders would come through military channels, delivered by a superior officer, not dropped from enemy aircraft in obviously fake propaganda. Onoda and his men decided to continue their mission. They retreated deeper into Lubang Island's mountainous jungle interior, establishing a hidden camp, preparing for a long-term guerrilla campaign. This decision would keep Onoda fighting for 29 more years, long after every other Japanese soldier had surrendered, long after the war had become distant history. In 1949, the first years after the war's official end, Onoda's four-man unit established a base deep in Lubang's jungle mountains. They chose a location with natural defensive advantages: steep slopes, dense vegetation, fresh water source, escape routes in multiple directions. They built a lean-to shelter camouflaged with branches and leaves, created hidden supply caches, scouted the island thoroughly. Their survival depended on stealing from Filipino farmers. They raided fields at night, taking rice, vegetables, corn, sweet potatoes. They killed cows and water buffalo for meat, butchering the animals quickly and disappearing before anyone could respond. They stole clothing, tools, cooking equipment from abandoned homes. To the local Filipino population, these raids were terrifying. The war was over, but Japanese guerrillas were still attacking them, stealing their food, killing their livestock. The Philippine government sent police and military patrols to hunt the Japanese holdouts, but Onoda's group evaded them easily, using guerrilla tactics to stay ahead of searchers. Onoda maintained military discipline. Each day followed a strict routine. Wake at dawn. Physical training, weapons maintenance, scouting patrols, camp improvements, intelligence gathering. The men stayed fit, stayed sharp, stayed ready for operations. But the psychological strain was enormous. 4 men, completely isolated, convinced they were fighting a war that everyone else believed had ended. No communication with command, no reinforcements. No clear objectives beyond survival and continued resistance. In 1949, Private Yuichi Akatsu cracked under the pressure. He could no longer maintain the fiction that they were serving a meaningful military purpose. The evidence that the war had ended was overwhelming. They were not heroes. They were criminals, terrorizing innocent civilians for no reason. One night, Akatsu simply walked away from the camp. He made his way to a Filipino village and surrendered to local authorities. He was interrogated, provided information about Onoda's group, then repatriated to Japan. Akatsu's defection devastated the remaining 3 soldiers. Onoda rationalized it as a breakdown, a failure of will. Akatsu had been weak, had succumbed to enemy psychological warfare. The remaining 3 men must be stronger, must maintain their discipline and continue the mission. They did not know this was only the beginning of their decades-long ordeal. The 1950s brought increasing pressure on Onoda's dwindling group. The Philippine government intensified search efforts. Local police formed specialized teams to hunt the Japanese holdouts. Search parties combed the jungle repeatedly, sometimes coming within meters of Onoda's camps. Onoda responded with increased paranoia and operational security. He changed camps frequently, never staying in one location more than a few weeks. He established elaborate early warning systems, placing markers on trails to detect if anyone had passed. He avoided patterns, varying his movements to prevent ambushes. The group continued raiding farms, but Onoda tried to minimize civilian casualties. His mission was guerrilla warfare against military targets, not terrorism against civilians. But in practice, the distinction blurred. The raids terrorized the local population. Several Filipinos died in confrontations with the Japanese holdouts. In 1952, the Japanese government sent search parties specifically to find Onoda and his men. These parties included Onoda's family members who traveled to Lubang Island, shouted into the jungle, left letters and photographs, pleaded for him to come home. Onoda observed these search parties from concealment. He saw his family, heard their voices, read the letters they left. He did not believe any of it. His Nakano school training told him this was sophisticated psychological warfare. The enemy had probably captured his family, forced them to participate in this deception. Or these were actors, carefully chosen to resemble his family. Or the photographs were fabricated using advanced technology. The evidence of Japan's surrender kept mounting. Search parties brought newspapers from Japan showing post-war reconstruction, photographs of Tokyo rebuilt, articles about Japan's new democratic government. But Onoda found reasons to doubt everything. Shalao, newspapers could be forged, photographs could be staged, actors could be coached. None of it constituted proof that his superior officer had relieved him of his duties. October 19, 1954, an encounter that would reduce Onoda's group further. Onoda, Kozuka, and Shimada were conducting a reconnaissance patrol near a Filipino village. They had become less cautious after years without serious pursuit. As they moved through rice fields at the jungle edge, a police patrol spotted them. Gunfire erupted. The 3 Japanese soldiers scattered, running for the jungle. Police bullets followed them. Shimada was hit multiple times and fell dead in the rice field. Onoda and Kozuka escaped into the jungle and fled to their hidden camp. That night, they held a brief ceremony honoring Shimada's sacrifice for the emperor. Now only 2 remained, Onoda and Kozuka, 2 soldiers maintaining a war that had ended 9 years earlier. The Philippine authorities recovered Shimada's body. They found his military identification, his weapon, his personal effects. They confirmed he was one of the Japanese holdouts who had terrorized Lubang Island for nearly a decade. The Philippine government announced Shimada's death publicly, hoping it might convince the remaining holdouts to surrender. They left messages in the jungle explaining what happened, offering safe passage home if the others would come out peacefully. Onoda interpreted Shimada's death as proof that the war continued. The enemy had killed his comrade. This validated their continued resistance. If the war was truly over, why would Filipino forces shoot at them? The logic was circular, self-reinforcing. Any evidence of peace was interpreted as deception. Any hostile action was interpreted as continued warfare. Onoda had constructed a mental framework where surrender was logically impossible. The 1960s saw Onoda and Kozuka settle into a grim routine. 2 men alone, maintaining a military organization of 2. They continued their guerrilla operations, though with diminished frequency and ambition. They raided farms perhaps once or twice per month, taking only what they needed to survive. They moved constantly, never staying in one camp more than a few days. They maintained their weapons obsessively, kept their military bearing, conducted training exercises despite having no realistic objective. The psychological toll was crushing. Human beings are social creatures. Isolation destroys mental health. Onoda and Kozuka had only each other for conversation, for human contact, for validation of their increasingly delusional worldview. They developed elaborate theories to explain away evidence of peace. Japan had not surrendered completely. Perhaps they had negotiated a temporary armistice. Or perhaps Japan had lost control of the home islands but continued fighting from occupied territories. Or perhaps the Americans had installed a puppet government in Tokyo while the true government continued resistance from elsewhere. These theories allowed them to maintain the fiction that their mission remained valid, that they were not simply criminals terrorizing civilians, that their suffering served a purpose. The Japanese government continued periodic search efforts throughout the 1960s. Family members returned to Lubang Island multiple times. Japanese officials offered amnesty, safe passage, medical care. They left more letters, photographs, newspapers, evidence of Japan's transformation into a peaceful, prosperous nation. Onoda ignored it all. By the late 1960s, most observers assumed Onoda and Kozuka were dead. 24 years had passed since Japan's surrender. No one could survive that long in jungle isolation. The raids had decreased. Sightings became rare. Perhaps the last holdouts had finally succumbed to disease, accident, or age. But they were still there, still surviving, still fighting their imaginary war. October 19, 1972. Exactly 18 years to the day after Shimada's death. Onoda and Kozuka were conducting a raid on a rice field, taking grain for their dwindling supplies. They had become almost supernatural in their ability to evade pursuit. 27 years of survival had honed their jungle skills to perfection. But on this particular day, their luck ran out. A police patrol was positioned nearby, having received intelligence about Japanese holdouts operating in this area. When Onoda and Kozuka emerged from the jungle to access the rice field, the police spotted them immediately. The police opened fire. Kozuka was hit and fell mortally wounded. Onoda returned fire, then fled into the jungle as more police reinforcements arrived. Kozuka died within minutes, bleeding out in the rice field at age 51. He had spent 28 years fighting a war that ended in 1945. He died believing he was serving the Japanese Empire. Onoda was now completely alone. For the first time in 27 years, he had no human contact. No companion, no one to validate his worldview. Just himself, the jungle, and his mission. Most people would have broken at this point. Would have recognized that fighting alone for a war that ended 3 decades ago was insane. Would have surrendered and accepted reality. Onoda did not break. He continued. The loss of Kozuka did affect him psychologically. He was now 50 years old, alone in a hostile jungle, with no reasonable hope of relief or victory. The mission had become purely about endurance, about refusing to surrender despite having no tangible objective. But surrender remained impossible. His orders were explicit: continue fighting until relieved by a superior officer. Those orders had never been rescinded. Therefore, he must continue. Logic demanded it. Onoda actually became more active after Kozuka's death. He conducted more raids, destroyed more property, made his presence more visible. Perhaps this was grief expressed through action. Perhaps it was an attempt to validate Kozuka's sacrifice. Perhaps it was simply habit sustained through 3 decades of repetition. The Philippine government escalated their response. Kozuka's death proved the Japanese holdouts were still active, still dangerous. They deployed military units specifically to hunt Onoda. They offered large rewards for information leading to his capture. They published articles about the crazy Japanese soldier still fighting World War II, but Onoda evaded them all. 30 years of survival had taught him every hiding spot on Lubang Island, every escape route, every water source, every cave system. He was effectively invisible when he chose to be. While Onoda fought his solitary war in the Philippine jungle, the world changed dramatically around him. Japan transformed from defeated empire into economic powerhouse. The devastation of 1945 gave way to rapid reconstruction and industrialization. By the 1960s, Japan had one of the world's fastest-growing economies. By the 1970s, Japanese technology and manufacturing dominated global markets. The emperor Onoda served was no longer divine. The 1947 constitution made Japan a democratic constitutional monarchy. Emperor Hirohito became a symbolic figurehead, rather than an absolute ruler. Japanese culture underwent massive transformation, adopting Western influences, abandoning militarism. Young Japanese people in 1972 had no memory of World War II. They had grown up in peace and prosperity. The war was ancient history, something their grandparents experienced, but had little relevance to modern life. And yet, in a Philippine jungle, a 50-year-old man continued fighting that ancient war, believing himself to be serving an empire that no longer existed in the form he remembered. The psychological disconnect was absolute. Onoda's mental model of reality had frozen in December 1944. Everything that happened after contradicted his orders and therefore must be false. He had constructed an impenetrable delusion that would require an equally extraordinary intervention to shatter. Enter Norio Suzuki, a 24-year-old Japanese dropout, and wanderer who would change everything. Suzuki was, by all accounts, an unusual character. He had no stable career, no permanent home, no conventional ambitions. He traveled constantly, seeking adventure, pursuing eccentric goals. He once explained his life philosophy simply. He wanted to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. Most people thought Suzuki was crazy. Onoda was almost certainly dead. Even if alive, he had evaded professional search parties for decades. What chance did an amateur adventurer have of finding him? But Suzuki had advantages the professionals lacked. He was not representing the government or military. He was not trying to capture or persuade Onoda. He was simply curious, genuinely interested in Onoda's story, approaching the situation without official pressure. In February 1974, Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island with minimal supplies. He hiked into the jungle, set up camp, and began a very simple strategy. He left signs that he was there. He called out in Japanese. He left notes explaining that he was not military, not police, just a young Japanese man interested in talking. Crucially, Suzuki understood Onoda's psychology. He did not try to convince Onoda the war was over. He did not present evidence of Japan's surrender. He simply offered contact with someone from home, no strings attached. For weeks, nothing happened. Suzuki camped, waited, called out periodically. He began to doubt his own judgment. Maybe Onoda really was dead. Maybe this was a fool's errand. Then one February morning, Suzuki woke to find Onoda standing at the edge of his campsite, rifle ready but not immediately threatening. The encounter was surreal. Two Japanese men, separated by 3 decades of experience, meeting in a Philippine jungle. Suzuki carefully avoided sudden movements. He spoke calmly in Japanese, introducing himself, explaining that he had come specifically to meet Lieutenant Onoda, that he meant no harm. Onoda remained suspicious but curious. This young man spoke perfect Japanese, knew Onoda's name and rank, showed no fear. This did not fit the pattern of previous contact attempts. They talked for hours. Suzuki asked about Onoda's experiences. Onoda described his 3 decades of jungle survival, his lost companions, his continued mission. Suzuki listened without judgment, without trying to convince Onoda the war had ended. This non-threatening approach disarmed Onoda's usual defensive paranoia. For the first time in decades, he experienced normal human conversation. Someone was listening to his story, validating his experiences, not immediately calling him crazy or criminal. Suzuki eventually mentioned that Japan had changed significantly since 1945. He described modern Tokyo, the economic miracle, technological advances. He suggested that perhaps Onoda might want to see contemporary Japan, purely for intelligence purposes, of course, to better understand the situation. Onoda was intrigued but remained committed to his orders. He could not simply leave his post. He required official orders from a superior officer to cease operations. Suzuki understood. He asked who could provide such orders. Onoda explained that only his direct commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, could relieve him of his duties. Suzuki saw the solution immediately. Find Major Taniguchi, bring him to Lubang Island, have him officially order Onoda to cease operations. Problem solved. Onoda and Suzuki agreed to meet again. Suzuki would return to Japan, locate Major Taniguchi, bring him back if possible. Onoda would wait. For the first time in 29 years, Onoda felt hope. Not hope for rescue exactly, but hope for resolution. Perhaps his mission was genuinely complete. Perhaps proper orders would finally arrive. Suzuki returned to Japan and immediately went to the government. He had made contact with Lieutenant Onoda. The holdout was alive, operational, willing to surrender if given proper orders by his commanding officer. The Japanese government was shocked and skeptical. Onoda was still alive after 29 years, still fighting, still requiring official orders. It seemed impossible, but Suzuki had photographs, proof of his encounter. The government had no choice but to take him seriously. They began searching for Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's commanding officer from 1944. This proved challenging. 30 years had passed. Many wartime officers had died. Many had changed identities, trying to escape their militaristic past. Many wanted nothing to do with reviving wartime memories. After extensive searching, they located Taniguchi. He was now in his 70s, long retired, living quietly. When contacted about Onoda, he was astonished. His young intelligence officer was still alive, still following the orders he gave in 1944, still fighting. The magnitude of the situation weighed on Taniguchi. He had given those orders. He had told Onoda to never surrender, to continue fighting regardless of circumstances. And Onoda had obeyed perfectly for 3 decades. Taniguchi agreed to travel to Lubang Island. He would officially relieve Lieutenant Onoda of his duties. The war would finally end for this last soldier, March 9, 1974, a date that would close World War II for one final combatant. Major Taniguchi, now elderly and in civilian clothes, traveled to Lubang Island accompanied by Japanese government officials, Philippine authorities, and media representatives. The world was watching. This story had captured global attention. The last Japanese soldier, finally surrendering after 29 years. Suzuki guided the party to a pre-arranged meeting spot in the jungle where Onoda would emerge. The atmosphere was tense. Would Onoda actually appear? Would he accept the orders? Was this all an elaborate trap? Then, from the jungle shadows, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stepped forward. He wore his tattered Imperial Japanese Army uniform, still maintained as best as possible after 3 decades. He carried his Arisaka Type 99 rifle, still functional, still clean despite its age. His sword hung at his side. His military bearing was perfect despite his gaunt, weathered appearance. Onoda approached Major Taniguchi, stopped precisely the regulation distance away, and saluted crisply. His voice was steady as he reported for duty, as if they had last spoken yesterday rather than 30 years ago. Taniguchi returned the salute. Then, voice heavy with emotion, he delivered the orders he should have given in 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The Emperor had ordered all military forces to cease hostilities. Lieutenant Onoda was officially relieved of his duties. His mission was complete. He should surrender his weapons and return home. For the first time in 29 years, Onoda received clear, unambiguous orders from his legitimate superior officer. Orders that superseded his original mission. Orders he could not doubt or rationalize away. Onoda processed this information. His face showed no emotion, maintaining perfect military bearing. But internally, his entire worldview was collapsing and rebuilding simultaneously. The war was over, Japan had lost. His 30 years of resistance had been pointless. His companions had died for nothing. He had terrorized innocent civilians, killed people, destroyed property, all for a cause that ceased to exist in 1945. The psychological impact was devastating. But Onoda was a soldier. He had orders. He would obey. He formally surrendered his rifle to the Philippine government representative, unstrapped his sword and handed it over. His ammunition, his military equipment, everything. After 30 years, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda was no longer at war. The assembled officials and media representatives watched in stunned silence. They had just witnessed the end of World War II, 30 years late, in a Philippine jungle. Onoda was placed under arrest by Philippine authorities. He had killed 30 people over 3 decades, destroyed property, committed numerous crimes regardless of his belief that he was following military orders. He would face trial, but the Philippine government, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances, granted him a full pardon. He was not a criminal. He was a soldier who had followed his orders with absolute loyalty. However misguided, his actions stemmed from duty rather than malice. Onoda was free to return to Japan. Onoda's return to Japan was overwhelming. He had left in 1944, departing from an empire at war. He returned to find a completely different nation. The Japan of 1944 was militaristic, emperor-worshipping, dedicated to conquest and expansion. Cities were intact, but preparing for American invasion. Everyone was mobilized for total war. Propaganda emphasized sacrifice, duty, fighting to the death. The Japan of 1974 was democratic, capitalist, pacifist, one of the world's wealthiest nations. Tokyo had been rebuilt into a gleaming modern metropolis. Technology had advanced beyond anything Onoda could have imagined. Japanese culture had transformed completely. Cars filled the streets, not just a few vehicles for the wealthy, but millions of cars in constant traffic. Television was universal. People carried transistor radios. Buildings rose dozens of stories. Neon lights advertised consumer products. Everyone seemed prosperous, well-fed, fashionably dressed. The psychological shock was profound. This was not the Japan Onoda had fought for. The emperor was still present but neutered, reduced to ceremonial functions. The military he served had been disbanded, replaced by a defensive self-defense force specifically forbidden from offensive operations. Young people showed no respect for traditional values. They listened to Western music, wore Western clothing, had Western attitudes. They had no interest in militarism, no dedication to empire, no understanding of the values Onoda considered fundamental. Onoda became an instant celebrity. Media covered every aspect of his return. Interviews, press conferences, public appearances. Everyone wanted to meet the soldier who fought for 30 years, wanted to hear his incredible survival story, but Onoda struggled with fame. He was not comfortable being celebrated. He had not done anything worthy of celebration. He had failed. Japan had lost the war. His mission had accomplished nothing. His companions had died pointlessly. Worse, public reaction to his story was mixed. Many Japanese viewed him as a hero, a symbol of loyalty and dedication. But many others viewed him as an embarrassment, a reminder of Japan's militaristic past that modern Japan wanted to forget. Some veterans respected his commitment, but others thought he was a fool who should have surrendered decades earlier, who had wasted his life and killed innocent people for no reason. Onoda felt completely disconnected from this new Japan. This was not his country. These were not his people. He had spent 30 years fighting for an empire that no longer existed, for values that modern Japan had abandoned. The initial celebration of Onoda's return gradually gave way to criticism and controversy. Philippine victims' families demanded justice. 30 people had died because of Onoda's actions. Farmers had been terrorized for decades. The Philippine government had pardoned Onoda, but the victims' families wanted accountability. Onoda defended his actions. He was a soldier following orders. He genuinely believed the war was continuing. He took no pleasure in violence. He did what military duty required. Yes, he killed people, but soldiers kill people in war. That is their function. This argument satisfied some people but enraged others. The war had ended in 1945. For 29 years, Onoda was not fighting a war. He was committing murder. His belief that the war continued did not erase his victims' deaths. Japanese left-wing intellectuals used Onoda's story to criticize Japanese militarism. They argued that Onoda represented the worst aspects of Japanese culture: blind obedience to authority, refusal to think critically, prioritizing duty over morality, inability to accept reality when it contradicted ideology. Right-wing nationalists defended Onoda as a pure embodiment of Japanese loyalty. In their view, Onoda was a hero precisely because he never surrendered, never compromised, never abandoned his duty regardless of circumstances. This was the Japanese spirit that modern Japan needed to reclaim. Onoda found himself at the center of Japanese culture wars, his story weaponized by different factions to support their political views. He became a symbol rather than a person, his actual experiences secondary to what he represented. The psychological burden was crushing. Onoda had survived 30 years of jungle isolation, but he was not equipped to handle celebrity, controversy, political exploitation. He had no friends in modern Japan, no family connections that felt genuine after so much time, no place in society. He began to retreat from public life, giving fewer interviews, avoiding controversy. He struggled with purpose. For 30 years, his purpose had been clear: survive, fight, never surrender. Now he had no purpose, no mission, no duty, just empty days in a country he no longer understood. Onoda tried to build a normal life in Japan, tried to assimilate into the modern world he had missed. He took a job with a trading company, leveraging his pre-war business experience. But workplace culture had changed dramatically. His authoritarian military mindset clashed with modern corporate norms. He could not relate to younger colleagues who seemed shallow, materialistic, undisciplined. He attempted dating. Several women were interested in the famous holdout soldier. But relationships failed quickly. Onoda could not connect emotionally. 30 years of emotional isolation had damaged his ability to form intimate bonds. He found modern women too independent, too assertive, too different from the traditional values he remembered. He tried reconnecting with family, but they were strangers. His parents had died during his absence. His siblings had their own lives, families, decades of experiences he hadn't shared. They treated him politely but distantly, like an obligation rather than a beloved family member. Onoda felt profound isolation. He was surrounded by millions of people, but completely alone. The jungle had been lonely, but at least he understood his purpose there. In Tokyo, he had no purpose, no connection, no meaningful existence. He began experiencing depression, not unusual for combat veterans, but particularly severe in Onoda's case. He had spent his entire adult life at war. He had no other identity. Soldier was his only role. Without war, without mission, he was nothing. He started drinking heavily. Alcohol blunted the pain, made the meaninglessness tolerable. He gained weight, lost fitness, stopped maintaining the military bearing that had sustained him for decades. Friends from his Nakano school days tried to help. They understood, at least partially. They were also struggling with post-war Japan, also feeling disconnected from modern society. But their struggles paled compared to Onoda's. They had adjusted over 30 years. Onoda had to adjust instantly, jumping from 1944 directly to 1974. After 2 years of attempting normal life in Japan, Onoda concluded it was impossible. He did not belong in this country. He had no future here. He needed to leave. Onoda made a dramatic decision. He would emigrate to Brazil. Brazil had a large Japanese immigrant community, established in the early 20th century when Japanese workers came to work on coffee plantations. By the 1970s, this community numbered over 1 million people. Many maintained traditional Japanese values while adapting to Brazilian culture. Onoda reasoned that Brazil might offer what Japan could not, a place where traditional values still mattered, where hard work was respected, where he could build something meaningful far from the controversies and memories of Japan. He purchased a cattle ranch in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso do Sul, in the remote interior. The ranch was isolated hundreds of kilometers from major cities, surrounded by wilderness. Not jungle exactly, but wild enough to feel somewhat familiar. The physical labor of ranching appealed to Onoda. He knew how to work hard, how to endure physical hardship. Ranching demanded those skills. He would wake before dawn, work until sunset, physical exhaustion making sleep possible without excessive drinking. He learned Portuguese, though he never became fluent. He interacted minimally with Brazilian neighbors, maintaining polite distance. He hired local workers to help with cattle, treating them fairly but formally. Brazil gave Onoda what he needed: purpose through work, isolation from controversy, physical challenges that occupied his mind. The ranch became his new mission, not fighting, but building, creating rather than destroying. He married Machie Onuku in 1976, a Japanese woman who emigrated to Brazil for work. The marriage was stable if not passionate. Machie accepted Onoda's emotional limitations, his inability to discuss feelings, his periodic withdrawal into memory. She provided domestic stability, companionship, someone to share daily life. Onoda spent nearly 20 years in Brazil. He ran his ranch competently, turning modest profit. He avoided publicity, gave no interviews about his holdout years. He tried as much as possible to become someone other than the last Japanese soldier, but he never fully escaped his past. His story was too unusual, too compelling. Periodically, journalists would track him down in Brazil, requesting interviews. Books were written about him. His photograph appeared in history texts, and within his own mind, the jungle years dominated. He dreamed constantly of Lubang Island, of his lost companions, of the life that made sense compared to the confusing modern world. 22 years after his surrender, Onoda decided to return to Lubang Island, not as a fugitive but as a visitor. He wanted to see the place that defined his life, wanted to confront his past directly rather than through dreams and memories. The Philippine government granted permission. Onoda was still technically a pardoned criminal, but enough time had passed that authorities felt comfortable with his visit. He arrived on Lubang Island as a tourist, accompanied by Machie. The island had changed dramatically since 1974. Development had reached even this remote location. Roads connected villages, electricity and running water were standard. The jungle he once hid in had been partially cleared for agriculture. Local Filipinos who remembered the holdout years had mixed reactions to Onoda's visit. Some viewed him as a celebrity, wanted photographs and autographs. Others remembered the fear his raids had caused, the people he killed, the decades of terror he represented. Onoda visited the sites of his former camps, now overgrown or destroyed. He stood in the rice fields where Shimada and Kozuka had fallen. He walked the trails he once patrolled, now marked with memorial plaques describing the holdout years. The visit was emotionally devastating. Onoda confronted the reality that his 30 years of resistance had accomplished nothing. The Philippines had prospered without Japanese occupation. The Filipino people were better off because Japan lost the war. His mission had been pointless from the beginning. He met with families of his victims, offered formal apologies, tried to express remorse. The conversations were awkward, translated through interpreters, complicated by decades of pain on one side and guilt on the other. Some families accepted his apologies, others did not. One significant outcome of this visit was Onoda's decision to establish a charity foundation. He donated money to build schools on Lubang Island, to fund scholarships for Filipino students, to support economic development. This was his attempt at restitution, his way of creating something positive from his destructive past. The foundation became Onoda's new mission, not fighting, not ranching, but helping the people he had once terrorized, giving back to the community he had harmed. This work gave him peace. Not forgiveness exactly, he did not believe he deserved forgiveness. But at least purpose, at least a way to make some small amends for the damage he caused. In 1984, Onoda established the Onoda Nature School in Japan. The school offered wilderness survival camps for young Japanese people, teaching them self-reliance, discipline, outdoor skills, traditional values he believed modern Japan was losing. Onoda was deeply concerned about what he perceived as the softness of modern Japanese youth. In his view, young people lacked discipline, physical toughness, respect for tradition. They were spoiled by prosperity, weakened by comfort, unable to endure hardship. The nature school attempted to address these perceived deficiencies. Students attended camps lasting several weeks, living in primitive conditions, learning wilderness survival, conducting physical training, studying traditional Japanese values. Onoda taught personally at many camps. He shared survival skills learned during his jungle years, how to find food in the wilderness, how to create shelter, how to endure physical hardship, how to maintain mental discipline during difficult circumstances. But he carefully avoided glorifying his holdout years. He did not present himself as a hero. He emphasized that his 30 years of isolation were a cautionary tale rather than an example to follow. He told students that blind obedience was dangerous, that soldiers must balance duty with ethical judgment, that following orders did not absolve moral responsibility. The nature school became moderately successful. Hundreds of students attended camps over the years. Some found the experience transformative, gaining confidence and self-reliance. Others thought the camps were overly harsh, that Onoda's militaristic approach was inappropriate for civilian youth education. Critics accused Onoda of trying to indoctrinate young people with right-wing nationalist values. He denied this, insisting he was simply teaching practical survival skills and self-discipline. But his curriculum did emphasize traditional Japanese values, respect for hierarchy, physical toughness, endurance of hardship, values associated with Japan's militaristic past. The controversy reflected broader Japanese ambivalence about Onoda's legacy. Was he a symbol of admirable loyalty or dangerous fanaticism? A hero or a cautionary tale? Opinions remained divided. Onoda wrote a memoir in 1974 titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War. The book became an international bestseller, translated into multiple languages, selling millions of copies worldwide. The memoir described his jungle years in detail, his survival techniques, his lost companions, his mental state during decades of isolation, his perspective on why he refused to surrender despite overwhelming evidence the war had ended. Critics noted that Onoda's memoir was not particularly apologetic. He expressed regret for killing civilians, but maintained that he was following orders, that soldiers in war kill people, that his actions were defensible within the context of military duty. This lack of deeper remorse troubled some readers. They wanted Onoda to acknowledge that his actions were wrong, that he should have surrendered earlier, that loyalty to outdated orders did not justify murder. But Onoda was fundamentally incapable of that level of self-criticism. Accepting that his 30 years were completely wasted, that his companions died for nothing, that he was simply crazy rather than loyal, would destroy his remaining sense of identity and purpose. He needed to believe his actions made sense within some framework, that he was a soldier doing his duty, even if that duty was misguided. Taking away that interpretation would leave only madness and murder. Onoda made numerous media appearances over subsequent decades, television interviews, documentary films, speaking engagements. He became a reliable source of unusual stories for journalists seeking interesting content. These appearances kept his story in public consciousness. New generations of Japanese people learned about the holdout soldier. International audiences discovered this bizarre footnote of World War II history. But Onoda remained ambivalent about his celebrity status. He participated in media projects because they generated income for his charitable foundations and nature schools. But he found the attention uncomfortable, the questions repetitive, the need to constantly revisit traumatic memories exhausting. Philosophical reflections on duty and obedience. As Onoda aged, he engaged more deeply with philosophical questions his life raised. What is duty? When does obedience to authority become immoral? How do soldiers balance following orders with ethical responsibility? These were not abstract questions for Onoda. They were the core issues of his existence. His entire adult life was defined by obedience to orders. But those orders led to decades of pointless violence. In later interviews, Onoda offered more nuanced perspectives than his initial post-surrender statements. He acknowledged that soldiers face genuine moral dilemmas, that following orders does not automatically absolve responsibility, that individuals must sometimes refuse orders they believe to be immoral or outdated. He still defended his personal actions, arguing that his situation was unique, that he genuinely believed the war continued, that surrender would have betrayed his companions' deaths. But he acknowledged that modern soldiers should question orders more than his generation did, should balance duty with moral judgment. These reflections suggested growth and evolution beyond the black-and-white thinking of his military training. But Onoda never fully reconciled the contradictions. He remained torn between loyalty to his former self and recognition that his 30 years accomplished nothing positive. Japanese military historians and ethicists used Onoda's case in discussions about military obedience, ethics in warfare, the dangers of fanaticism. His story became a teaching example, illustrating the importance of critical thinking even within hierarchical military structures. Some scholars argued that Onoda represented the worst aspects of Japanese militarism: absolute obedience without moral consideration, prioritizing loyalty over human life, inability to accept reality when it contradicted ideology. They saw his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind nationalism. Others defended Onoda as embodying admirable loyalty and dedication, noting that most people lack the strength to maintain principles under extreme adversity. They argued that modern society could benefit from more of Onoda's discipline and commitment if redirected toward constructive rather than destructive ends. Onoda made multiple trips to the Philippines throughout his later years, continuing his reconciliation efforts. He met with more victims' families, offering increasingly genuine apologies as he gained perspective on his actions' impact. These meetings were emotionally difficult for all parties. The victims wanted acknowledgement of their suffering. Onoda wanted forgiveness he knew he didn't fully deserve. Some families accepted his apologies and reconciled. They recognized that Onoda genuinely believed he was following military orders, that he took no pleasure in violence, that he suffered psychologically from his actions. Other families remained angry, unable to forgive. Their relatives were dead because of Onoda's delusions. No amount of apology could bring them back. Onoda's psychological state did not excuse murder. Onoda understood and accepted their anger. He never demanded forgiveness. He simply offered what amends he could through financial support, public acknowledgement of his victims, and charitable work benefiting Lubang Island communities. His foundation built multiple schools, funded agricultural development projects, provided scholarships for hundreds of Filipino students. These projects did not erase the past, but created some positive legacy from his destructive years. The Philippine government recognized Onoda's reconciliation efforts with several honors and awards. They acknowledged that while his holdout years were criminal, his subsequent actions demonstrated genuine remorse and desire to make amends. This recognition helped Onoda's psychological state. He needed to believe his life had some redemptive arc, that the destruction he caused could be partially offset by subsequent construction. The Philippine honors validated that narrative. Onoda spent his final years splitting time between Brazil and Japan. He maintained his ranch, worked with his charitable foundations, gave occasional interviews, participated in historical documentaries about World War II. He stayed physically active well into old age, maintaining fitness through ranch work and outdoor activities. His jungle years had given him exceptional physical conditioning that lasted decades. But age eventually caught up. In his late 80s, Onoda's health declined. He developed heart problems, respiratory issues, the accumulated toll of 90 years, including 30 in extreme conditions. He died on January 16, 2014, in Tokyo, Japan, at age 91. The cause was heart failure. He was surrounded by family, died peacefully, experiencing no dramatic deathbed revelations or final conflicts. His death generated significant media coverage. Obituaries appeared in major newspapers worldwide. They described him variously as the last Japanese soldier, as a symbol of misguided loyalty, as a cautionary tale about fanaticism, as an example of incredible survival skills. The obituaries reflected continuing ambivalence about his legacy. Was he a hero or a fool, a symbol of loyalty or fanaticism, a victim of military indoctrination, or an autonomous agent responsible for his choices? These questions remained unresolved. Different people drew different conclusions based on their own values and perspectives. His funeral in Tokyo was attended by several hundred people. Japanese veterans, former Nakano school classmates, students from his nature school, Philippine government representatives, media figures who had covered his story over decades. The ceremony was formal, military precision honoring a soldier who maintained his military identity until death. But it was also sad, acknowledging a life defined by tragedy, loss, misguided duty. Onoda was buried with military honors in a Tokyo cemetery. His gravestone identifies him by his rank, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, Imperial Japanese Army. No further description necessary. His identity was his service. Onoda's story raises fundamental questions about sanity, reality, and the nature of belief. Was Onoda crazy? By conventional standards, yes. He maintained a delusional belief system that contradicted overwhelming evidence for 30 years. This is definitionally insane. But was he psychotic? Probably not. He functioned effectively, survived in extremely challenging conditions, made rational tactical decisions, maintained physical and mental discipline. These are not characteristics of someone experiencing psychotic break from reality. Onoda's delusion was specific and contained. He believed the war continued. Outside that belief, he functioned normally. He could reason logically, solve problems, interact with others. His insanity was narrowly focused. Psychologists who studied Onoda's case noted that his belief system was not random psychosis, but rather logical extension of his military training. Nakano's school explicitly taught students to never trust claims that Japan had surrendered, to assume such claims were enemy psychological warfare. Onoda followed this training perfectly. Too perfectly, he took the lesson to its logical extreme, creating an unfalsifiable belief system where any evidence of peace was automatically interpreted as deception. This suggests that Onoda's insanity was actually hyper-rationality within a flawed framework. Given his premises and training, his behavior was logical. The problem was the premises, not the reasoning. This has troubling implications. If Onoda was not fundamentally crazy but rather following his training, then the military training itself was the problem. Nakano's school created soldiers programmed to never accept reality if it contradicted orders. This is a recipe for exactly what happened. The Japanese military's emphasis on never surrendering, on maintaining duty regardless of circumstances, on prioritizing loyalty over survival, created psychological conditions that made Onoda's 30-year holdout possible. In this interpretation, Onoda was not an aberration, but rather an extreme but logical outcome of Japanese military culture. Other soldiers accepted reality more quickly, not because they were more rational, but because their indoctrination was less absolute. Onoda was not the only Japanese holdout. Several other soldiers continued fighting after 1945, though none for as long. Private Teruo Nakamura surrendered in 1974 on Morotai Island, Indonesia, also after nearly 30 years. His case was less publicized, but psychologically similar to Onoda's. Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi was discovered in 1972 on Guam, having hidden for 28 years. Unlike Onoda, Yokoi knew the war was over but was too ashamed to surrender, fearing punishment or disgrace. These cases suggest Onoda's experience, while extreme, was not unique. Multiple Japanese soldiers struggled to accept their nation's defeat, struggled to surrender despite knowing intellectually that the war had ended. This reflects the intensity of Japanese military indoctrination. Surrender was presented as absolutely unacceptable, worse than death. Soldiers who accepted this teaching found post-war reality psychologically impossible to process. Comparisons can be made to cult members who maintain beliefs despite contradicting evidence, or to political extremists who reject facts conflicting with ideology. The psychological mechanisms are similar. Commitment to a worldview becomes so total that abandoning it feels like psychological death. Onoda maintained his worldview because abandoning it meant accepting that his entire adult life was wasted, that his companions died for nothing, that he was a criminal rather than a soldier. This was too painful to accept while maintaining psychological integrity. Onoda's story transcends his individual experience. It illustrates broader themes about duty, loyalty, reality, belief, and the human capacity for both incredible endurance and terrible delusion. On one level, Onoda's story is inspiring. He survived 30 years in extreme conditions through discipline, skill, determination. Few people could endure what he endured. His survival alone deserves recognition. On another level, his story is tragic. He wasted his life fighting a war that ended before he began his jungle mission. His loyalty and determination were directed toward pointless objectives. His companions died for nothing. His victims died for nothing. On yet another level, his story is cautionary. It demonstrates the dangers of absolute loyalty, of following orders without critical examination, of allowing ideology to override reality. Modern military forces study Onoda's case when teaching about ethics, about the importance of questioning orders, about balancing duty with moral judgment. His story illustrates what happens when obedience becomes absolute. But perhaps the deepest meaning concerns the nature of reality itself. Onoda's story shows how belief can create alternative reality, how humans can maintain worldviews contradicting all evidence when those worldviews serve important psychological needs. We all live within belief systems that structure our perception of reality. Most of us modify those beliefs when confronted with contrary evidence. But under certain conditions, intense indoctrination, psychological investment in specific beliefs, social isolation, reinforcing delusions, humans can maintain completely alternative realities indefinitely. Onoda lived in such an alternative reality for 30 years. He was not stupid, not ignorant, not lacking evidence that the war had ended. He simply could not accept that evidence because accepting it destroyed his identity and purpose. This is not as far from normal human psychology as we might like to think. We all filter reality through belief systems. We all resist evidence that contradicts core beliefs. Most of us just don't take it to Onoda's extreme. His story is a mirror, reflecting aspects of human psychology we prefer not to acknowledge. The capacity for self-deception, the ability to maintain beliefs despite contrary evidence, the power of ideology over reason. How should we judge Hiroo Onoda? Hero, fool, victim, perpetrator? He was all of these simultaneously, which is why his story remains compelling. He was a hero in his incredible survival, his loyalty to companions, his refusal to give up despite hopeless circumstances. These are admirable qualities taken in isolation. He was a fool in his inability to accept reality, his continuation of pointless violence, his waste of 30 years that could have been lived productively. He was a victim of military indoctrination that destroyed his ability to think critically, that trapped him in delusion, that wasted his life in service of a cause that no longer existed. He was a perpetrator who killed innocent people, terrorized communities, caused enormous suffering, regardless of his beliefs about the validity of his actions. All of these assessments are simultaneously true. Onoda was a complex person whose story resists simple moral categorization. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson. People are complicated. Actions have multiple meanings depending on perspective. Loyalty can be both admirable and terrible. Duty can be noble or destructive. The same qualities that enable survival can also perpetuate harm. Onoda's life forces us to confront these contradictions, to acknowledge that humans are capable of simultaneously inspiring and horrifying behavior, often driven by the same underlying motivations. He was the last soldier of World War II, but he was also a person who spent most of his life trapped in the past, unable to move forward, defined entirely by commitment to a moment that ended decades before he accepted its ending. His story is tragedy, not triumph, but within that tragedy are elements worth remembering, worth studying, worth learning from. We remember Hiroo Onoda not to glorify his actions, but to understand them, to learn from his mistakes, to recognize the dangers of absolute loyalty, to appreciate the importance of questioning authority, to understand how easily humans can become trapped in delusion when belief systems override reality. He survived 30 years in the jungle, but in a deeper sense, he never left December 1944. His mental world remained frozen in that moment, in those orders, in that duty. True survival requires adaptability, accepting changed circumstances, moving forward rather than clinging to the past. Onoda survived physically but remained psychologically trapped until March 1974, when Major Taniguchi finally released him from orders given 3 decades earlier. His story is a reminder that sometimes survival is not enough, that life requires more than endurance, that human beings need purpose, connection, adaptation to changing reality. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, the last soldier of World War II, died in 2014 at age 91. His war ended in 1974, but the war's impact on him, the psychological imprisonment it created, lasted until his final day. We tell his story not to judge him, but to understand, to recognize our shared human capacity for loyalty and delusion, to appreciate the importance of critical thinking even when obeying orders, to understand that sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to surrender.